you, Charles. That might be the most gracious, if not the longest introduction I've ever had. But really, it was very genuine, and I'm very grateful, so thanks. I mean, when Giles invited me, I was flattered, obviously. But more so than flattered to come because, and I knew this would happen. I mean, this sort of moment where I'm looking out at you guys right now, and you know, I was sitting exactly where you were sitting 30 years ago, and 29, and you know, brings back a flood of memories. And I don't remember anything from 29 years ago now, but I do remember some of the things that I know I wasn't thinking about. And that was really kind of what was on my mind when Giles asked me to come visit with you. So I've been very fortunate. Bonaventure has served me very well. Catherine asked me at dinner, what's the single best thing that I experienced at St. Bonaventure University? And I actually struggled a little bit because there's so many, and she knew I would. I could tell when she asked the question. But I really sort of settled in on the thing that it was home to me. It was very easy just to sort of exist or be. Not that my life or studying was easy, but it was just a very comfortable place to be in that respect. And it allowed me to develop, and I made incredibly good friends, lifelong friends. In fact, I'm standing up in one of their weddings next month, so you will have friends for the rest of your life as a result of it. And those are the kind of things I was thinking about 30 years ago, is developing those friendships. What I wasn't thinking about is what is a professional? What is a profession? Do I want to be a professional? And it does sound like a throwaway question. It absolutely does. But I've been giving it a lot of thought in recent years, and so I thought I'd just sort of share some of that with you. Let me ask you guys a couple of questions. And by the way, just interject at any point in time. I don't really have a completely structured set of remarks, although I got a little bit of an outline in my head, as Jal knows, right? 5 pages. Look at that. Now, so let me ask you, so I know we had some business students here. I'm just kind of curious what other fields are represented here. So we've got some scientists, biology, chemistry. What other fields? Chemistry. Advertising. Okay, very good. English.
Political science.
Poli-sci.
Journalism.
Journalism.
Strategic communications.
Strategic communications. All right, I like that one. Okay, now, so of this, do these areas, these are your areas you're studying, do they represent aspirational careers for you? Okay. So I was in finance, as Giles said, and I never really thought about what it means to be a profession. So have you, do you have any, what comes to, well, let's start this way. What comes to mind when you think of a professional? What's a professional? Professional what? Just anything that's out there.
Someone who's really good at their job.
Really good.
Suit and tie.
Suit and tie, okay. Athletes, professional athletes. So what's the difference between an amateur athlete and a professional athlete?
Money.
Yeah, they're making money, right? Okay. Academics?
Musicians.
Musicians, you got professional musicians, all right. What else? What else comes to mind? Where are the accountants in this conversation? You guys got to speak up for yourselves.
Yeah, well, accountants.
Accountants, all right, okay. You have any law students? Okay, you're pre-law? Okay, lawyers come to mind. We got some biology folks. You're not doing pre-med though, right? You are? Okay. So what comes to your mind? Okay, sure, okay. And so, and then professions, it's just sort of a collection of a gaggle of these folks. So, what characteristics do these things share? What makes them a profession?
Franciscan leaders.
Franciscan leaders. Oh, I actually have a Franciscan thread to throw in here. That is great. So hold on to that thought. That's excellent. All right, so if you sort of actually listen to the hype that any kind of professional association tells you, there's the 3 E's. It's education, experience, and ethics. I'm going to add a couple more onto that, okay? But these are the 3 legs of a stool that hold up a professional body. And CFA Institute is the professional membership organization for the investment management industry. I will try to make this conversation far more general than CFA Institute, so we're going to pull on a number of areas, but investment management will be some of them. And we basically have 3 lines of business. We've got my business, which is the credentialing. I create curriculums and exams, and I test people and make their life miserable for a while. Then our second business is professional membership. People go through that process, they become members, and they need to do continuing education. They want to hang out with other members, and they want us to promote their brand. And then our third line of business is advocacy. And that is basically, in our case, building financial market integrity and protecting the interests of investors. Okay? So, how does this fit in with the 3 E's? So, I'm going to start with education, which is my business. And it's kind of helpful, I think, to be thinking about the difference between a professional designation, a credential, and an academic degree. A designation is generally more narrowly defined than a degree. It's very specific. It's grounded in practice in almost any and all things that it does, whereas degrees can be far more broad. And not only are they grounded in practice, their body of knowledge is well specified. There is an outline, an accepted set of competencies that this designation must assess the mastery of. And, if you're signing up for Natty World, there's sort of general things that come out of that, or general things that come out of a strategic communications degree, but not a generally accepted, very specific set of practice-based competencies. Another difference is that once you got your strategic communications degree, nobody's taking it away from you. That's what I was always told. Son, you got to go to school. No one will ever take that away from you, but I can take your designation away from you. What would cause me to take a designation away from you? Being unethical. Whoops, exactly. Anything else come to mind?
Not being good at it.
Not being good at it, making bad decisions. Exactly. Not maintaining your professional competence. Okay, so there's a number of things. So there's a temporal characteristic to the education. And I got some great quotes here, which is why I need this. But there's an icon in our field called Stuart Shepard, and he says that. This goes back to the 60s. And he says that what should be the hallmark of a profession? A common body of knowledge to be acquired only through systematic study, rigorous objective examination, conceived and conducted by the Institute that is sufficiently isolated and insulated from industry involvement. So there needs to be an objectivity to this. And a code of professional ethics that would have a community of integrity, and in our case, among CFA charter holders. So, this then becomes a condition of entry, okay, whereby if you are to enter this profession, the only path through it is to check that box. And if you don't check that box, you're not practicing in that profession. So what's interesting is we actually don't have a profession in investment management, because anyone sitting in this room can register with the SEC, you can hang out a shingle, and you can start collecting people's money, and you can manage it for them. Not a single one of you need to have my designation or anybody else's to do that. So unless and until that time comes, we're actually only aspiring to be an investment management profession. So experience is the second E. All right? It becomes important because everything is so practice-based that people actually qualify in some way, shape, or form other than just passing an exam and doing study. Okay? And in a lot of fields, this experience varies dramatically. So in medicine, what's the experience look like in medicine?
Well, in medical school, your last 2 years you'll go on clinical rotations, but then afterwards, when you get your subspecialty, you go into your residency, and then you have a fellowship, and sometimes an internship as well, and then technically you're...
And so after all of that, and that's a whole lot of experienced, of supervised working with patients. In the UK, part of the exam to become a barrister is actually sitting down in front of a client. It actually tends to be a mock client, and they present their situation, and your job is to counsel them. And that's part of the assessment. It's not the totality of the experience, but it's actually integrated into the assessment. In Europe, the apprenticeship model is very strong, where rather than rotating like you might in medicine, you're actually kind of anchored down and tied to a particular person or subspecialty for quite a while. So, and that's not a model that's necessarily taken hold in the States very well, but that's a critical element, that it's not just an academic exercise. Giles had wanted me to talk about ethics. And so, and I will, because that's the third E. It's critical, and there's a lot of different dimensions to it. I used to think that there's no such thing as medical ethics, there's no such thing as investment ethics, and there's no such thing as legal ethics. There's just ethics. There's right and there's wrong, and it kind of doesn't really matter what walk of life you're in. And I think at sort of a very philosophical level, that's probably true. At a practical level, it's completely useless. It doesn't at all function. It doesn't at all guide how it is that professionals are going to deal with either their client, their patient, their investor. So you need a specific set of codes that are designed for the situations that present themselves in that discipline, that are the application of the philosophy to better guide people. At CFA Institute, we've got a code of ethics and a set of standards of practice. They're relatively, we call them principles-based, okay? The U.S. tends to come at regulation from a very rules-based perspective. In this situation, you can't do this and you can do that, and it's very prescribed in black and white. It encourages folks to say, okay, well, you didn't completely paint my situation perfectly, so I can create a situation that's not exactly that and find a way around it. In Europe, regulations tend to be more principles-based. So that the pathology of that is it requires a little bit of interpretation in order to apply, monitor, and enforce them. But it tends to cover more situations. I used to think when I was sitting where you were that when Giles brought practitioners in and they started to talk about, oh, you know, we're looking for people that are ethical, we don't want to hire people that aren't, that, you know, it was just sort of a gloss. You know, they kind of had to say that, you know. They're in front of young people, they're talking to St. Bonaventure students, you know, it's kind of a necessary thing. It's part of the package. And it took me a while to figure out that, in fact, no, they actually really mean every word of it. And a lot of it goes back to this notion of being a professional. So what kind of elements do you tend to have in a professional code? The primacy of the relationship between the professional and the client is central. It means that in any and all matters, the client's interests come first. So in the case of healthcare, right, you think of the Hippocratic Oath, right? You know, do no harm. It's all about the patient. It's not at all about the practitioner. And it's no different in investment management. If you ascribe to the CFA Institute code, if you are a CFA charter holder, I'm obligated to put my client's interests ahead of my own at any and all times. And then I have to put their interests ahead of my employer's interests. And I have to put the interests of the profession as a whole ahead of my own. Okay? I'm third best. Okay? And you really need to subjugate yourself and subjugate your own interests for the greater good. It's a very different thing. And frankly, I didn't have that mindset coming out of school. I was just ready to build my career. Right? I wanted to get on the path. I wanted to make some money. I wanted to prove myself and prove my worth. But there's a much larger frame in which that takes place. Any questions up to this point?
So you were describing with the CFA, are there investment portfolios that are managed that some investment bankers don't follow fiduciary contracts with their clients? They don't have to abide by any sort of CFA standard? Is that just a higher being within the investment world?
I hate to use the phrase higher being, but there is, yes, it is a higher standard. So there's a number of business models, for example, that don't necessarily conform very nicely to that fiduciary standard. So, so this strikes right at the heart of how we do business, right? So if I collect a commission, all right, for security trades, I've created a situation where my incentive is not necessarily to do what's best for the client, but to trade. And maybe that's good for the client, maybe it's not. But it creates the potential for conflict of interest. And as a fiduciary, it's my job to avoid those conflicts whenever possible. Not all conflicts can be avoided, but when they're unavoidable, then it's my job to manage those conflicts. So, so yes, there's two sort of camps, if you will, in investment management that sort of play by two different sets of rules. That's absolutely true. And you know, it feeds into this other notion that I'd like to spend a little bit of time about, because it's not really listed as one of these three E's, so I added on. But it boils down to a profession provides a warranty to the public, right? There's a social contract there, right? It's when you enter a profession, there's certain rights and privileges that are bestowed upon you, okay? There is prestige and there's status, and there is regard. And in economic terms, in many cases, there's barriers to entry. And once I talk about the notion of having a condition to entry, it sounds really good, you know? Well, hey, you know what? You have to prove yourself if you're going to hold yourself out, okay? But that's creating a barrier to entry. And where does that barrier come from? It has to come from a source of authority. Very often it's the government or some proxy of the government, a regulator or a self-regulatory organization. But there's someone keeping the unqualified out. All right? And that barrier has economic advantage, doesn't it? All right? There's the barrier even in mandating the that one ascribes to a code of ethics. That becomes a barrier. All right? So what does the professional give back to society in exchange for these rights and these privileges? And it's the promise that they will put investors' interests, well, in the case of investment management, ahead of their own. They will put patients' interests ahead of their own. They will put, the accountants will put their clients' interests ahead of their own. It's all about protection to the end client. And that's the societal good. And that's really the bigger picture and the larger frame that I had very little awareness of. There's a great quote here from a guy by the name of Stuart Shepard. And he puts it like this. In fact, society demands more from a profession and its members than it does from a professional craftsman in trade, arts, or business. In return for status, prestige, and autonomy, okay, a profession extends a public warranty that it has established and maintains conditions of entry, standards of practice, and disciplinary procedures. I haven't talked much about that. And continuing education for its particular constituency. Much is expected from members of a profession, but over time, much is given. So I went into finance because I liked it. I was just intellectually stimulated by the study of finance. It was an amalgamation of math, which I loved, statistics, economics, even a dose of accounting, okay, which for me can be overdone, so it was the right dosage for me. But it was just an intellectually stimulating field. And then the second reason I said is, I can actually make a career out of this. I can probably do pretty well for myself. And it was all pretty self-serving for a good long time before I realized what was actually going on. And so I kind of wanted to get you guys thinking about that. Because if you're anything like me, you haven't. And be thinking about whether or not your path is a path towards a profession, or if it matters, and it might not. It might not matter to you. So, so let's give that some thought. So, you're doing accounting, right? Profession or not?
I'm going to get my CPA.
Yeah? So do we think CPAs are professionals? Why?
Because you have to go through a testing process that's like, I guess, I don't want to say as vigorous, but it's pretty vigorous, like the CFA. You have to study a lot, and there's like a very low passing rate, so you really have to like work hard to get to it.
What about the other elements? Do you need work experience?
For the exam, I don't think you do.
To get, what about to ultimately receive that designation, that coveted CPA? Do you need work experience for that? Probably do.
I mean, I know at the least you need to, you need like internships just to get the accounting degree.
Mm-hmm.
That would be work experience, technically.
What about a professional code? Are you asked to ascribe to a professional code? Are you tested on it? Yeah. No, I think it has the elements of a profession. Is there a warranty to the public? There is. Explain to me what that warranty looks like or why it exists. What societal service is the accounting profession providing?
you have to provide information to inside and outside stakeholders in the company to make sure that it's like they're getting the right information and so they can use the numbers correctly to make decisions.
Mm-hmm. That makes society better off. It's transparency. Right? It's comparability. Okay, very good. What about, so you said law? Okay. Does it have these elements?
Yes.
I thought lawyers were all snakes.
No. Contrary to popular belief.
All right, so there's a bar exam, right?
There is.
Okay. And there are, what do you call them in law? There are, there's ethics. A lot of ethics. So let me ask you this. Why do attorneys have such poor reputation?
I think it's the nature of the law. They're caught in a lot of gray areas. And I think it goes back to, well, you kind of said it when you were talking about the United States versus Great Britain based on principle or rules. In American law, like you said, there's a set of rules, and there are a lot of attorneys that will dodge around and find those gray areas and situations where they can skirt the rules. Whereas here in Great Britain, it's based on principle, and it's harder to get around principle than it is, 1, 2, or 3 you must abide by.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just by mere what they're doing, they put themselves at risk for ethical breaches here and there, and it's how they deal with them that defines them. And well, of course, we always capitalize on the bad ones.
Mm-hmm. You're not in the profession, so you don't answer this question unless you feel like you're. But is it a frequent conversation? Is it top of mind when there's a day-to-day decision to be made? Is a consideration in those decisions almost always, is this in the client's interest? Is this the right thing? That's part of what you want to have in the back of your mind. And that goes to culture of a business or a firm you're in, culture of a profession, is what's the mindset? And the mindset reveals itself through their day-to-day decisions and what's on the top of our mind. There's a very famous behavioral economist by the name of Dan Ariely from Israel. He's in the States now. And he ran a really fascinating experiment. And the experiment he ran was he just gave people an ethical dilemma and asked them to make a choice about how to respond to that ethical dilemma. And there was a moral choice and an immoral choice to be made. And what he did was he separated out a control group that just took that question and addressed that moral dilemma straight away from an experimental group that was primed. And they were primed by being asked to recite the 10 Commandments before they were faced with this ethical dilemma. And some could recite 8 of them, and some could recite 2 of them. But as a group, they made the ethical choice twice as often as the control group that didn't try to recite the 10 Commandments before being presented with that situation. And what was fascinating about the experiment is he made another cut beyond that. He separated the really smart ones that could get 8 of the 10 Commandments from the ones that could only get 2. And he found that, it really didn't matter if they were able to recite more or less. That's not what influenced their decision making. What influenced their decision making is where you framed, where you placed them before they had to make that decision. So that's why frame of mind is so important, is because if you're not accustomed to being there and going there with frequency and habitually, you won't go there when you actually need it. And I would say that it's a more amorphous but no less important mark of a professional, is that you're always asking what's in the client's best interest. Other questions?
yet JW answered about the law, the way the American system works. The client's best interest is very often unethical. An unethical act, pad, or decision. So does the ethical thing then permit unethical behavior?
That is a brilliant question, and it boils down to basically two things: articulating to whom one owns a duty. So yes, one owes a duty to a client. One owes a duty to an employer, perhaps, and one owes a duty to a profession. And then also, at least indirectly, I've laid out the argument that one owes a duty to society by virtue of the rights and privileges that have been conveyed on them. So then the question becomes, okay, I owe duties to multiple parties. Whose interests take precedent? Is essentially what your question is.
I would add one more layer.
Okay.
Is there a level above even that?
And what might that level be?
We get into, and we'll have to pump this one over to the philosopher in the room, but is there such a thing as an ethical truth?
There may be.
A higher standard that supersedes all of these things, so that you come down to, and pardon me, I shouldn't be talking so much, but it comes down to the question, is this right?
I think there undoubtedly is. Where I think the interesting debate would be is if it matters. And at least in the context of the profession. And I'd really be interested to hear what Giles' thoughts are on this. But I might circumscribe the problem around that societal benefit, which probably in most cases is going to correspond very closely with the more philosophical right and wrong. But I say that by virtue of the fact that that's a contractual thing, implied or otherwise.
Thank you. Well, I started in philosophy. I drifted into finance. I drifted back into statistics. Statistics involves uncertainty. In an uncertain world, there can be no, in my opinion, objective ethics. You cannot say, if you're faced with an uncertain world, that this is always wrong, because somebody will always be able to come up with an example, however heartbreaking, where you can say, no, killing is not wrong, because under these circumstances, however heartbreaking, how awful it is, it was the right thing to do. In the absence of certainty, you cannot have, in my opinion, objective ethics. So I've always objected to objective ethics. Now, if you ask me, what's the alternative? Well, the greatest number of the greatest good. Well, there are unsatisfactory aspects to that. Subjective ethics, there's unsatisfactory aspects to that. So I can't give you an alternative, but I do not believe that an objective right or wrong is tenable in an uncertain world. And I'm sure that everyone can think of, well, I would never, ever do this. Oh, really? Well, there are circumstances where you might.
Yeah, I think for me, there's two really good takeaways from this. One is that don't think you won't be faced with ethical dilemmas in your professional life. You will. And some of them will be big, and it's going to be uncertain. So just expect it.
I would, if I could add one more thing, of course, Professor is absolutely right in what he said. And to me, then, it comes down to where the answer to this is being a professional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sounds trite, but it boils down to the small things. If you look at most of the financial scandals that have occurred over the years, whether it's MCI WorldCom, Nick Leeson and Barings Bank, and you follow the story of the people that were at the epicenter of the poor decision making, not a single one of them came in and said, I'm going to go defraud somebody. Never happens. The very rare individual that comes in and just has a black mind and dark heart. Okay? What happens is that you have individuals that sometimes they make a mistake. Oh, Nick Barings got upside down on a trade. Okay? He was in a position where he was able to, put some wallpaper over it. And while the wallpaper was on it, he was going to go over here and do some more trading to try to get himself out of the mess. And once he got it resolved, the wallpaper will come off and it'll be fine. Okay? But unfortunately, that trade went wrong too. So under the wallpaper it went, and it continued. The accounting scandals happened exactly the same way. Just little things that don't seem like a big deal, they're relatively inconsequential. And if that's all that they were was little things, they probably would be inconsequential. Okay? But it's just the start of a string of things that grow and snowball. And unless you just sort of have in your heart the fortitude and mindset of what's right and what's wrong with the small stuff, that big stuff can just get away from you before you even know it. So read the book Stolen Without a Gun. Great book about the MCI WorldCom scandal. And just a normal guy looking for a job, got a job in the accounting department, was asked to do a couple of things just to sort of book this over here because we had trouble collecting money from a customer over there. Not a big deal, it was just a matter of budgeting. That's all. That's how it started. So, there by the grace of God. That's all I can say.